Hi guys, this is Prey 2017, published by Bethesda, developed by Arcane Studios, same guys who are behind Dishonored and Dishonored's sequel, and Dishonored's sequel's sequel. So we're going to start off by attacking the Wikipedia article, just like I normally do. And the first thing that I wanted to mention is the fact that this title is considered an FPS. That is some of the first words on this Wikipedia article. Actually, it says, Prey is a first-person shooter survival horror video game. Well, at least in this time, the video game thing, I'm willing to concede. But the survival horror, I mean, I guess the soundtrack destroying your ears is kind of scary. The loading screens are pretty horrible too, so maybe there's some horror elements there. You know, counting the seconds that you're losing to this game, the minutes, the hours, the brain cells. Then you've got first-person shooter in here. That I feel like is so completely incorrect. I mean, it definitely has more depth than the average first-person shooter. If it were actually slated and marketed and designed as a first-person shooter, it would be much more like a game with much more depth than an FPS ought to have generally. But it doesn't have enough depth to be considered an RPG either. I'd classify a game like this as an ARPG. Very hack and slashy. Combat's a bit more freeform than your average RPG tends to be. But you have less tools. You have less progression systems that are, less in-depth, just less depth to your progression systems, I guess is the best way to talk about that. Best way to form your sentences in the English language when trying to make a point like that. Then you have the fact that the game plays out like an elaborate puzzle game when you're not in combat. And when you are in combat, it's basically just hurry up and finish so that you can go back to the stuff that we actually put effort into. And in that way, it feels very much like an interactive novel or something, like one of those H games that are so popular on Steam. And I think the fact that the lack of progression systems, the lack of, essentially like tactical analysis you have to do in the middle of combat, it's certainly not fast-paced enough to be a situation where you have to make, very quick decisions based on what's happening. It's really just, plan out ahead of time, which is sort of like a classical RPG, but the tools that you have at your disposal to make your battle plans are not as varied, not as engaging as your average RPG is. So I would call this a first-person action RPG. Certainly nothing about survival horror in there. I guess your resource management is there, so maybe that's related to the survival bit, but I mean, whatever. I can't imagine anybody who plays this on anything other than Nightmare having any difficulty with it whatsoever, and then even then it lasts for about half the game's running time, and none of it is due to the fact that you're not good at the game. It's all due to the fact that the game doesn't really allow you to be good at it in the first place. Being good at it involves removing entire functions of the game from the play. We'll get into it, don't worry, but it's just a very peculiar way to describe the game in general, and calling something a survival horror game intimates that there's some element of skill involved in actually surviving, I think. And maybe that's just me reading into it. But I don't think that it can be classed as that either. Now, what is he? The lead designer? Hold on, I lost my place in this fucking Wikipedia article. It's pretty big. Let's see. Raphael. Where are you, Raphael? He's got a simulation name. Okay, Arcane Studios CEO and director Raphael Colantonio. He's like, I'd D, but Tony. Like, this game is more of a simulation after I read about it than it is in the game. Is a simulation within a simulation that starts out in a simulation, and we live in a simulation. I just can't even get into why this is so retarded. But, there you have that. Now, what did he say? So he was the lead developer as well for this. He's a CEO and director of the company and also led development in this game. And he's quoted somewhere here talking about how he wanted the game to be an open world, or he wanted to, have open world elements into the game. And indeed, the Wikipedia article even says, after their first sentence, that says, it's in the development section, something about it being an open world. Point is, it's not. I mean, technically, it probably is considered. You can consider BioShock an open world. Well, you can probably consider this game an open world, or to have some elements of open world gameplay. But the setting feels so contained that the only reason why it feels to have any scale at all, really, is because it takes you so long to progress from point A to point B. I mean, the loading screens are one reason why, but another part of it is the fact that you have these there's no fast traveling in the game, right? Which I'm not necessarily against entirely, but I think they needed to use their space mechanic a bit more. They needed to develop that a lot more, and they needed to use it more often, so that there was more depth to actually moving around in space, more repercussions for doing it, or more things engaging with you in space, as well as on the station, of course, but especially in space. And they needed to make it so that there was some sort of consequence, right? Like an obvious one that could leaps off the page immediately when you say there should be a consequence to going into space is that if you continuously go through space and ignore the actual station, then maybe it gets more and more overrun with Typhon. And when you actually have to go there for a quest, or, just for the sake of convenience or something else, then you have to deal with the fact that you haven't been maintaining this area and cleaning it up. But there was never really any consequence for your actions in individual situations, and in fact the game would also often reset a lot of the stuff that you did. Like, I'm thinking about the Arboretum has this looking glass thing that I smashed the first time I saw it, and then I smashed it the second time I saw it, and then I smashed it the third time I saw it, and then I said fuck it because it's never saved. But obviously that's a very minuscule amount. There's no interactivity there really, but the fact that that continuously happens is like, maybe that's a bug. It didn't happen in other areas, so I assume it's a bug. But yeah, a very, very bizarre situation to be in. And so the fact that your visual impact is not really there. Like, sometimes it'll save your glue and other times it won't. And you can chalk some of that stuff up to like the Typhoner taking over, and maybe they destroyed your glue in the process or something for whatever reason. I don't know. Because sometimes those areas would indeed be repopulated, but not as much as I thought, and certainly didn't seem like I had anything to do with it, that I could do anything about it. And even when I would place turrets and make sure the turrets were well maintained, they don't actually start shooting anything until you walk into view, almost like the developers were like scared of having dynamic events that occur on the map that you weren't privy to. And even though that would make sense, because that's part of what makes stuff an open world, is that it does stuff when you're not there in that area. I mean, that's what you have with Typhon showing up in various parts of the environment. So you'd think, but no, they didn't. Anyways, these are like the first 2 points of the fucking review, and we're already a couple minutes in here. So basically, the fact that the map itself was so contained, the playable area was so constrained by maybe the narrative, maybe some other weird decisions that were going on behind the scenes. Maybe technical issues, I don't know, but they were it felt pretty constrained, especially when you take a step back and you stop thinking of it in the terms of like, well, I have to constantly run around and deal with really long loading screens. It doesn't actually feel that large. It certainly doesn't feel larger than, say, Rapture, and, that didn't feel like it was exceptionally large either. And even Dark Souls, as much as that game is a fucking disaster and basically has no content, the environments in Dark Souls 1 and 2, I haven't played the third one, definitely feel like there's more to them. At least there's actually more playable space. Obviously, it doesn't engage with you very much because there's not even any fucking AI in that game. But at least the areas that you can engage with or walk around in and explore, like there's more to it there. So it definitely doesn't feel like this is an open world game in the conventional sense, especially since your actions and your enemies' actions don't seem to really interact at any point, unless you're there to witness and respond. And that is like the hallmark of a really weird development choice, where it's like you have to make sure that the player sees the impact directly instead of being able to infer based on, natural, like, cause and effect type scenarios, So, not a fan of that at all. Very, very much felt like a smaller world as a result of that, I think. One of the things that I always say, especially since I come from RTS, I come from StarCraft, is that if there's multiple AI, there's like a free-for-all going on or something, or I have an ally and they have like, more than one AI enemy on a team, or, it's a 2v2 or something like that, that feels much more like a large-scale battle, because there's stuff going on that I'm not directly responsible for, that I can respond to or interact with and engage with, but not necessarily forced to in any way, and it's not like an event set in motion by me could result in something different, or it could just be the result of the autonomy of my opponent or my ally or whatever. And so when you have a free-for-all and you walk into a battle that's happening that has nothing to do with you, when you witness something like that, there's a strong chance you don't witness all of those battles, or even the majority of those battles, because you don't have active vision in the area. But even if you don't have any presence in the area, they're still happening. And when you do witness some of that stuff, it feels that much more impactful because you feel more like a small piece of a larger puzzle. And as a result, the scale immediately becomes bigger because you have to factor that in when you're analyzing the battlefield, as there are things going on that I'm not responsible for responding to and responsible for creating in the first place. And that is something that really does make humans feel smaller in the game world. So the fact that was never really taken up in this context, outside of maybe some scripted events, it makes the environment feel pretty fucking small overall. So that's the first thing that I will levy at it, besides all of the other banter that I had at the beginning. I did mention the soundtrack. It was by Mick Gordon. He's credited anyways in the Wikipedia article. Yet again has produced a score that is incredibly loud and overbearing. Dominates the soundstage almost entirely, to the point where I can't really hear anything from the actual game when there's some sort of stinger or audio cue or something like that. And I don't know, man. There's just there's a lot of really funny videos out there of people fucking around with the music in this game too, where they'll like walk into an area and the music will change to like really ominous, and then they'll walk back out the door they came in and the music will change to some different stinger, and then they'll just keep going back and forth and tripping the music up over and over again. It's really psychotic. And of course, every time you charge up a wrench attack, there's a little beeper, or I don't even know what, it's not a beep, it's like a bass drop or something that happens. It's very strange. Like, if anything, there should be I guess that you'd think that that's subtle, but that blends in with all the music and a lot of the other sounds, and so I can't even fucking tell when that's playing half the time. Where it's actually important to have an audio read for when my attack is ready to go. And so there's probably a lot of times, especially in the late game, where there's a lot more going on. There's like transmissions happening all the time in the middle of combat for some fucking reason, where I'm in the middle of trying to figure out whether or not my hit is going to stun or not. And that only happens when it's fully charged, as far as I can tell, or it has a chance to happen other times. But for the most part, it's a guaranteed stun if you hold it and charge it up. And I need to know that for gameplay purposes, but there's probably a lot of times where I held on too long, longer than I needed to. And I generally pride myself on being able to execute like auto attack cancels in RTSs, like, and MOBAs and stuff. I'm generally pretty good at that stuff, but if there's no way for me to actually know, and it's a game that I've only played 10 hours of or whatever, it's probably not going to happen necessarily. But like reloading in CS:GO, for example, I have a pretty high percentage rate of like not needing to then say fuck, I didn't cancel the reload animation just right, so that I can by switching to my knife and then switching back or whatever. There's times where I feel like that's like an area in particular with games that I have a pretty good track record of, and the fact that I wasn't really able to express that here, I think, is entirely due to the fact that the audio read was completely absent from the late game or any other time where there was a lot going on. And part of it is adapting to a new read, but at the same time, something that's crucial and also is something that you get within like 20 minutes of the game or whatever, 30 minutes of the game. I don't know, man, that was pretty psychotic. So the fact that was still a pretty big issue, I think, says a lot about this title. Soundstage in general was pretty horrible, though. Anyways, that was Mick Gordon. Thanks. Go fuck yourself. Now, this Colin Tony guy, he says, he's quoted as saying that they had to choose between shipping a PC demo and shipping a console demo. For the 360 or no, the Xbox One and the PS4. I don't know what fucking PS69. And so the consoles got their demo and the PC didn't. And his logic for this is there's a 2-hour refund window down on Steam. So download it there. And if you don't like it, refund it. Now, ignoring the fact that not everybody necessarily has the money or the financial security to throw down $60 fucking dollars for your game just so that they can then return it and get their money back the next business day. And, maybe some people want to play the demo beforehand, before they make the decision to buy, because they want to see if it's a good thing or not. Ignoring that fact, and also ignoring the fact that Steam probably counts, it doesn't subtract refunds from sold titles for the purpose of rankings or whatever on their own website, because that's just psychotic to me. The problem with this logic is, I think it's pretty obvious, but the game wastes your time for over an hour with its stupid simulation opening, and at that point you have less than an hour to get a good feel for what the combat of the game is actually going to be like, and whether or not to get any idea of what the substance of the game is. And so, you couldn't have picked a worse title besides maybe that Gordon Freeman game that came out recently, Hunt for the Freemaners. I don't remember what the fuck it was called. But besides that game, which is deliberately designed to scam people out of refunds, I don't think you could have picked a worse title to say just refund it if you don't like it, because by 2 hours in, you don't even know what the fucking game is about. That's less time than I played for the first opening video of the game, and that's not even counting the runtime of setting up settings. And some people take somewhere between 10 to 30 minutes just setting up their game, especially if they're going to be streaming it or recording it or something like that, like I was. And let alone the average consumer, they need to get their fucking PC settings set up. They might need to go and open up a fucking INI file for all I know. And so you don't know any of this stuff. So giving them a 2-hour window to see it instead of being able to have infinite play times of a demo, and also not have to actually put in any financial investment before they do so, I think that's asking a little much, especially since this game probably did sell for $60 when it came out, given its publisher. So I just can't understand this logic. That says a lot about the disconnect of this person. Fucking Colin Tony, man, needs to eat your refunds. Now, on release, this game was quoted, or what's the opposite of panned? I guess praised. It was praised by PC Games N. I don't know why they have an N on their name, probably just because of more simulation, and Eurogamer. More like you, gamer. They are quoted in the wiki article as reacting favorably to the game's performance and lack of bugs on launch, which that is fucking insane to me. This game is one of the buggiest titles that I think I've played recently, and that's why I opened up by calling Bethesda Bugthesda, besides the fact that they published and developed Skyrim. But just the fact that you have this save glitch, that I think I referenced in the second or third video. I don't really remember. I referenced it probably throughout the Let's Play, but Chalks, who initially turned me onto this game, said that there was a glitch on launch that would just corrupt your save file. And apparently that I was at risk to have that happen to me, to the point where the game couldn't be completed and your save file was unsalvageable. So the idea that this is something that could happen to your game on launch, and games journalists, even if we wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, which I never would, you're telling me that they didn't play the game enough to find a bug like that, and they didn't talk with any of their circle of friends or circle of colleagues who also played the game to see if any of them encountered it? Did they do any research? Did they have any, it's either that they're deliberately not reporting on the problem, which is obviously because they're a marketing firm, not a games journalist. And, it's either that or they just decided that it wasn't that important to talk about. It was, it's just, it's not important to even redo any research to verify that whether or not this something like this happens, to even know that whether or not it exists. So, either they're actively, deceiving people by omitting this sort of real important thing. As a consumer, if I were to pay $60 on launch for a game based on your website's recommendations, and you don't disclose this kind of information, I mean, imagine if I had a glowing recommendation for this game, but it was still suffering from this bug. If I didn't bring it up, and I knew that even for a second, some person somewhere could take my opinion and use that to fuel their purchasing decision, I would feel liable for that. And I'm not even a fucking journalist. So I don't know how these people can get away with being called journalists instead of marketers. But yeah, the fact that save glitch was just conveniently absent from most of the reviews, especially these two people that actually praised the game for stuff that it didn't have, like performance and bug-free launches, Whew, oh boy. Of course, the save glitch was reported by consumers and YouTube reviewers, as opposed to those marketing firms we talked about earlier. Modern games journalism. Whew, holy moly. Anita, come back. So the last thing I'll talk about with the wiki article, and then we can get into the meat of the review, 20 minutes in, of course, classic me, is the insane trademark dispute. So there's a game called Prey of the Gods, and for whatever reason, ZeniMax, who also is involved in this disaster for some reason, not Prey of the Gods, Prey itself, Prey 2017, said that they had to defend their trademark over the game Prey, or the word Prey for the title or whatever. I don't know how Prey of the Gods, which doesn't look or play anything like this game, as far as I can tell, could possibly have been, it's spelled the same way, P-R-E-Y, not P-R-A-Y, like prayer of the gods or whatever. Like, it's actually Prey. They had to avoid this lawsuit, this legal action, and so they renamed their game P-R-A-E-Y, Prey of the Gods. That is so fucking absurd to me that But I just wanted to bring that up because that is so fucking hilarious and just so absurd that like they just added an A, so now they've got both spellings in one word. I can't handle that. And of course, this game also really angered a lot of people because the 2006 Xbox 360 launch title Prey was supposed to get a sequel, and this game is actually a reimagination of that IP, even though it's nothing like it. Has almost no, like, literally even the Wikipedia article is like says like the only similarity between Prey 2017 and Prey 1 from the 2006 360 launch title, the only similarities are that humans are fighting aliens. Yeah, so it's vaguely science fiction. Like that's also really funny to me. So, I just wanted to drop those two little tidbits in there, just so you know. This game is actually supposed to be a reimagination of the original Prey from 2006, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with it, has no similarities at all, and Bethesda just probably decided, hey, call it Prey so that we can ship, have some other marketing element when we ship. Disaster. So, in order to try and ingratiate myself to the game a little bit more, we're going to talk about what I thought was good about the title. It's a short list, so don't worry. We won't be here long. We'll get into the meat of the review pretty soon. Good shit first. Well, the setting is pretty distinct. It remains pretty fresh in my mind even after the end of the game, and it's one of the things that really did stick with me. I'm a sucker for science fiction in general. I really like sci-fi. That means that, of course, as an elitist, I tend to only like the best of the best, and this game definitely did not present its setting very well. It didn't do its setting very, justice with anything that was constructed around it. But the initial, aside from the fact that the story has a lot of pacing issues at the beginning, the initial presentation of the setting, where there's Typhon and the whole simulation trope, that I thought was pretty cool, actually. And the fact that the setting also sort of comes full circle with that, the whole thing being a simulation, I don't think it's that bad of an idea on paper. And the fact that the aliens also were not a complete ripoff of anything that immediately comes to memory, that makes the game pretty unique. I don't care if, you're comparing this to other sci-fi games or other sci-fi, titles in other media. I can't remember the last time I, experienced a science fiction, work of art or creative expression that involved an alien race that didn't seem derivative of something else, right? Like you look at StarCraft, everything's just copied one-to-one from Warhammer 40,000. You look at, I guess Warhammer 40,000 started to copy off of StarCraft too, which is pretty psychotic. But I don't know, just like, you have that. You've got, obviously Star Wars is hilarious. I guess I haven't really fucked around with Star Trek too much, so there might be something there, but that's pretty old as well. So like in terms of modern media, I think that this game is pretty interesting and unique in that respect, because the Typhon do not really seem that similar to anything else. They do have that weird glitchy element to them, which I think is overplayed and also doesn't seem rooted in, reality. I guess you could say that that's like a hint to the simulation, which is unfortunate, because another problem with using simulation as an element is that you can very easily hand wave away any concerns with the game's thematic consistency and presentation, because you can just say that any bugs that you saw were actually bugs with the simulation. And also having a silent protagonist means that it doesn't, an alien silent protagonist, it means that there's no real reason to for your character to speak out about it, right? And to say anything about it. And so it's never drawn attention to, and bugs can be dismissed as intentional, even though they're not. And I'm not necessarily claiming that the developers are trying to claim that either, because I don't think they are. I just wanted to bring that up because that is something that is inadvertently going to bite the developers in the ass, because they had this cool idea to have simulation be a part of this whole setting, and it comes with its downsides. There's always a give and take. So that is that's unfortunate. But I think the aliens are interesting enough as a concept. The setting is I think it's pretty strong. The environment is done in a way that, even though it doesn't look very good graphically and technically speaking, a lot of the talent is very much missing, we'll say. The production value is very, very low. I would say that the implications and thematic elements of the setting, it's very promising. It has a lot of potential. Just wasn't realized. So as far as simulation is concerned, I think that also, and again, having a protagonist that is an alien, I think these are all really interesting things and could have been really interesting reveals, impactful twists, had they not been basically spoiled for you by the game previously, with all of those weird flashbacks where Tony was like, referring to the viewport as it instead of she or he or anything like that, or zer. So yeah, I don't really know why they decided to include that there. Like, I guess maybe they were worried that it wouldn't seem reasonable if they didn't have some sort of foreshadowing, but they could have done it more intelligently. They could have made it so that, again, I wasn't able to immediately predict the twist as soon as I saw the first one of those. And even before that, I predicted the twist that it was a simulation within a simulation, because maybe that's just where my mind goes. But I don't know. It's just something about the game that was one of those things that I can't really explain, so I'm not necessarily faulting them for, but I definitely think the inclusion of those weird flashbacks to when I planted the one that I know for a fact happened in the final video was when I planted the null wave device on the coral core. I think it was a coral node. Yeah. And when I did that, or scanned to the second coral node or something, that was when we had the one of the flashbacks occur. And so when that happened, that's an example of what I was talking about. There was the first one was pretty early on into the story, I think maybe in the second or third video. And at that point I knew basically we were Typhon the entire time. And I was interested to seeing where they would go with that, because even though I had spoiled the twist for myself by reading into what they were saying, basically they had spoiled it for me. I was still interested to see where they would take that and how they would reveal it. And then I would be able to refactor my analysis of that based on, if I didn't know the twist from the beginning, how satisfying would it be? And of course, you're never going to get exactly how satisfying that would be, but you can still judge it from an objective, efficient standpoint. Like, how efficient was it at communicating what it was trying to communicate? Didn't end up being really that interesting, though. I don't know. I think that the story is probably its strongest point, and it's also where all of the development focus went into, and all of their focus went into is ways to experience the story, unfortunately. And the story very much came first. And so I don't think that it was good necessarily. I don't think it was super positive. I think the setting and the premise are really good, really strong, could be turned into something really, really excellent. The actual execution of the story itself, even when you don't take into account the fact that it's marred by everything that's around it, is probably just average. Definitely could have been way better. And that essentially everything but the setting and some of the story concepts fail entirely to impress me, especially amidst the fact that the rest of the game, again, is in absolute shambles. So let's get into my criticisms of the game. The reason I accused it of wasting the player's time for over an hour is, like I said, the intro, where it's like a simulation bit. It paints the title as something that it's like a game that really wants to tell a story. Like that's the feeling I get from this game, and that's something that I got very early on when there were so many pacing issues where you basically had this really long, lengthy not even really a tutorial, because you didn't learn that much about like how the game's systems interacted with each other. It was really just like, here's the first chapter to a book. Oh wait, we're making a game. Fuck. And like that's what it felt like to me. Is like, you know, they had to they were like, oh yeah, I guess we got to work on some gameplay for this stuff, guys. Oh, that's whatever. They can just sit in a helicopter and, you know, walk around and interact with computer terminals and like it felt very much like a walking simulator at that point. And not necessarily that the walking simulator part is what I couldn't shake, but I really couldn't shake the idea that they really wanted to tell a story, and that's what they focused on. And I feel like that's a really big problem. If you're going to make a game, it needs to be engaging. You need to engage with the player, interact with them. You need to give them tools to interact with you back. And you got to figure out, based on the genre of game and the kind of gameplay you want to cultivate, the kind of systems you want to work on, you got to figure out the specifics. But it has to be engaging, right? Like, if it's going to be good, it's got to be engaging. And this game was just not engaging in any way when it comes to interacting with its systems and interacting with its enemies. And so, as a result, I don't think that this is actually the case, especially when you think of all of the work that must have gone into some of the mimic stuff. But the gameplay does feel very much an afterthought compared to the story and the setting and the environment. You look at the fact that the Nightmare difficulty is... actually, I got a quote for you about Nightmare. This is what will help color the rest of the understanding of the game and really reinforce the point that the gameplay was an afterthought. So this is from Chalks, who says... I think he said that it was scrubbed from the internet. I was asking him for a direct source. He said he couldn't find it, only on the Wayback Machine. So, difficulty in Prey is just a straight damage dealt / received modifier. With normal as a baseline, Nightmare comes with a 20% damage dealt debuff and a 60% damage received debuff. Yes, this means that you deal 20% less damage than you do on the normal difficulty. You receive 60% more on Nightmare than you do on normal. Generally, this just means that Nightmare is more tedious and resource-intensive than normal because the core of the challenge is the same in both cases: avoid damage using the proper tools for the encounter, but it just takes longer on the higher difficulty. Great. So what this demonstrates to me is that they didn't really know what to do with difficulty systems in general, how they were going to make the game hard, and they just decided that more numbers would do the trick. Now, for one... Dante's Inferno is like an obvious example of this, where enemies will deal 3 times your max health in one hit on the higher difficulties because some intern just like pushed a couple of buttons and increased some numbers, and that was their job for the day. Then they went back into the fucking rat's holding cell where they belong. Now, the problem with this is pretty self-evident for me, but in case anybody's curious, take for example the electronic zappers. They deal 91 damage, something like that. 91, 92, maybe 88 or something like that. But they deal almost 100 damage is the bottom line. You have 100 health at the start of the game. So if you've taken a hit from anything else, which even at max armor deals, I think like a basic mimic attack deals over 20 damage. So over a fifth of your health, which means you can only take 4 hits, I think. 4, maybe 5 from the weakest enemy in the game, that besides Femoids, I guess. It's the most common enemy that's also the weakest enemy in the game can hit you 4 times and you die. And this is on the hardest difficulty. Now, I'm not necessarily against that if you have a reasonable amount of tools to handle that. You don't at this point. You just have your wrench and I think a glue gun or something. Dealing with enemies that are incredibly mobile. But the electricity is incredibly frustrating because if you've taken 1 hit from anything, you die instantly. Now, this is not something that you can even know occurs for the first time, and of course is made really funny that where I think I didn't get the tooltip to go away until the final segment or something, the final video, after over 10 hours or 13 hours or whatever of gameplay. I finally got that tooltip to go away because for whatever reason they don't consider the tooltips, they don't consider them red if you die. Like, say you interact with a tooltip or an audio log or something, and you listen to it all the way through, but then you die and go, your last save was from before you interacted with that item. Well, now it goes back and resets your progress on that, which is really funny to me. Something that definitely wouldn't need to happen, in my opinion. But whatever. So, of course, since it was one hitting me every single time I walked into it until I had 300 health and I could afford to take the damage. that's I mean that's why I only got it at the end of the entire playthrough. That's when I finally conquered that tooltip. I don't even get me started on the fact that they even tutorialized with tips to begin with. But so that's like a real big problem, right? So that's a very easy way to explain why modifiers are not a good way to do it. Also, they don't scale with how strong you get in the late game. So when you do have 300 health, which is an absurd amount of health, that's the max health you can get in the entire game as far as I can tell. When you do finally get there, you now can basically just shrug off all of those attacks. And when you have, for example, a fully upgraded shotgun, you will be able to answer the fact that I get this gunsmith, or it's a firearms, I think is what it's called. It's a neuromod, which is essentially at some point you get 20%. And that means that you're no longer penalized for picking the nightmare difficulty, basically. What a difficulty modifier should do is change AI behavior and change how the AI and the game at large interacts with you. I don't know if the modifiers are literally the only thing that are affected by Nightmare. Maybe there's an increased spawn rate of, repop rate of areas with additional units or something. Maybe there are other numbers that are tweaked. But it's very obvious that AI is really stupid in this game. Enemies basically do nothing. They don't even hear you use a fucking loud-ass shotgun to execute somebody next to them, which is psychotic to me. And so they don't know that you're in combat, even when you're fighting these military droids that are supposed to be pretty advanced. They might do some damage to you, but if you're beating the shit out of two of them with a wrench, your starting weapon, and you're just smashing the shit out of them, there's a third one like walking around basically right in eyesight at that point. And they're not like calling all of the other droids that are nearby and saying like, hey, we found our primary target, who in the story, she's our primary target. Everybody get over here and attack. Like, they don't just swarm you for some reason. Like, that tells a very stupid story, right? That paints them as incredibly dumb robots. And so I think that that's really psychotic. Anyways, we look at it from that perspective. We look at it from the perspective of, hey, this is, not engaging, right? This is just numbers. These are just, essentially adding more tedium, right? Like what I read from Chalks, adding more tasks you have to complete, more boxes you have to check, and more neuromods you have to install in order to receive less damage and deal more damage, to the point where the modifiers are literally meaningless or no longer have an impact. And as a result, you've negated them. Congratulations. You no longer have to worry about actually, like basically it's like you're playing on normal at that point, right? And so there's no lasting impact to making the decision to play on a harder difficulty, because there's no actual increase in difficulty, because the player's skill expression doesn't matter. You can get better at playing Prey, as better as the game will allow you to, and the AI obviously don't scale with you. They don't try to do anything else where they're like, maybe trying to adapt to what you're doing. This is supposed to be an advanced alien, maybe a construct or something, and you're trying to characterize the Typhon as these big baddies that are able to use these psi powers, and the only reason we're able to install neuromods at all is because of the Typhon themselves. Like, that's a pretty obvious example of you'd think that they would be able to adapt. You'd think that these things that allow us humans to adapt at all would be able to adapt themselves, but they just have some advanced phantoms, and that's basically the only thing that you could even consider adaptation. But that doesn't feel like they're adapting to you doing certain things with the systems and the storytelling, or the various ideas that you have, like the various tools that you have at your disposal, rather, to engage with them. It doesn't feel like, oh, you're using a lot of, EMP charges, so I'm going to, stop having my phantoms adapt to the voltaic version and instead have them be thermal. Suddenly your EMP is useless. Like, obviously that's very binary and not very interactive and not very engaging, but that would at least imply that these Typhon can actually adapt and be intelligent, but instead it's just RNG stuff. So it doesn't actually feel like they ever adapt, even though they give us the ability to adapt ourselves, and presumably are learning from us to some degree. So yeah, very, very silly. Tells a story of a set of AI enemies that are just really stupid, ultimately. So there's also really only 4 different kinds of enemies. You could potentially count the Femoids as a 5th, but you have the robots that I mentioned. You have the big guys, which are like the Technopath, the Weaver, the Telepath, You can even count the Nightmare in there because he's nothing. He's really not that interesting at all. Very basic. Then you have the humanoids, which are the phantoms, and I guess the mind-controlled enemies as well. Those are pretty psychotic. They just detonate and kill you immediately. And then you have the small guys, which are the mimics and the greater mimics. Really just very silly overall. The fact that there's not more enemy variety, the fact that there's not more weapon variety, technological variety, system variety, the ability for you to actually engage and in a more in-depth manner, be able to use different systems and different combinations a bit more. Like, there's just not enough ability to be creative. You can only be creative in the ways that the developers want to allow you to be creative, which is, it sounds like a catch-22 because, of course, any system that they put in is going to have its limits, but it's not really. Like, they could have been much less restrictive with the things that they ended up doing, and I think that they really missed a big opportunity here with this title. So, ultimately, the fact that you can only use these combos of things, and it just ends up being like a stun and stun these units until they're dead. There's never enough of them on screen to punish you for doing something like that. So of course that's always going to be the most optimal way to play if you're not just one-shotting them like with your sneak attack or something. Like Chalks mentioned that if you really scale up with stealth, then one of the things that you can end up doing is using, again, your loud-ass shotgun, crouching behind them, and or I guess you can sneak while like running later on or something psychotic. But you move around to sneak up behind enemies. You shotgun them with a sneak attack, and you upgrade your sneak attack damage and critical strike and all this other nonsense. And you get to the point where you're using your shotgun to just one-shot enemies as soon as you walk up to them, including phantoms, which are pretty fucking powerful. In the mid game, and especially in the early game where they were destroying me. And so it leads to this really ugly like situation where there's you want to let your game be solvable, but you want to allow for as much expression of individual player playstyles as possible. I was literally Supermaning through the game in the late stages, running around. Think back to the final video where, in particular, a Superman moment that I think I'm very fond of is when I was smashing all of these robots that come out in the last act. I roll through there and jump up into the air after dashing, smash through some glass into the tech officer, which is actually another robot, and just smash the shit out of that robot. And there's like 2 robots chasing after me. I don't give a fuck because I have 300 health. Like, this feels very absurd in a game that is otherwise pretty grounded in a serious tone. And yet you have fucking Nerf crossbow and just other such shit. The thematics are all over the place in this game. Apparently their marketing was really hilarious as well. I tried to be really memey so that you could, attract normies. But it clashes very heavily. Not the marketing, because it doesn't matter to the actual game, but the game itself, allows you to be really absurd with the things that you're doing because the setting doesn't actually support any one individual play style. And so since nothing is really reinforced to be thematically consistent in terms of like the story that you tell by expressing your gameplay and your preferred play style, you're never really feel connected to the actual setting. And that's another reason why the setting falls apart, I think, is because you never really feel very grounded in it. But the setting itself is played mostly straight. Even the Nerf crossbow is played incredibly straight to the point where nobody even comments on the fact that you're using it at all. Even especially, obviously, your silent fucking alien protagonist. And so I think that there's a huge issue with this title and its thematics. But one of the reasons why is because you're allowed to do stuff like that, even though it's heavily suboptimal, to the point where I have this shotgun that can basically kill any unit, and I was not really using it that much in the later stages because it was more satisfying to use the wrench, even though I would, be taking way more damage than I would need to. When I could finally sustain that damage and still come out on top, I would be using the wrench over anything else because it's more satisfying and requires more skill to actually hit things, ironically enough, than this ranged gun. Because you basically have to use the shotgun as a melee weapon or its damage falls off. So that was another thing that I thought was weird, but whatever. It's just a very strange situation to be in, right? Where your gameplay is so restricted where you're not allowed to play the game the way that you want to play it, even though that's something that they tried to market the game as. Like, in your opening mission, like within an hour and a half, you get this tooltip that pops up and gives you the solution to these problems that you're facing and says, solve this puzzle by option A or option B, and remember this for future puzzles that will also have more than one solution. And it's like, what a ridiculous experience. Like, you shouldn't really have to, spell this out. You should just let me figure that out on my own by way of finding the solution organically. And of course, it was just very obvious. Most of the solutions were incredibly obvious. I think there was one part in particular that I fucked up on where, because I was throwing objects at this door and they weren't opening, the Nerf crossbow didn't occur to me to use that to open the door, even though I was able to throw these items through a window. So I would have actually been able to open the door to the morgue if I had used the Nerf crossbow, if I had known that interaction existed. But of course I didn't know. I didn't bother reading any tooltips or anything because that's a horrible way to communicate information to the player. And so I don't even know if that was spelled out anywhere. It probably was. But it would have been pretty obvious had I known that. But again, it doesn't follow because I'm throwing objects at this thing that are much heavier than a Nerf crossbow, whatever the bolt, and still nothing. So that was really shitty, all in all. Just another instance of inconsistency. And the fact that weapon upgrades negate the impact of even the most powerful enemies, the fact that those enemies behave stupidly even on the highest difficulty, and their challenge, quote unquote, is just the fact that they can have way more mobility than you and can one-shot you because you take way more damage, meant that the combat itself never felt like it was like it got into itself, right? Like I purposefully avoided the psi powers because they felt to me like they were going to trivialize the encounters that I was having, where skill expression would be even more absent. And then I upgraded my shotgun and found out that was going to happen no matter what. And so that was a real rude awakening. But that was the main reason why I didn't bother with psi powers, in addition to the fact that I figured that turrets were going to be really prevalent throughout the game. And so becoming a Typhon in that respect would actually just destroy me. So especially since I played I think up until the penultimate segment before actually getting any hacking, which is really funny. So there's no way that I could really have done anything besides destroy all of the turrets that I saw, which would have really strapped me for resources at that point. So that was another consideration. But I think most of the part, I was looking at some of the powers and stuff, and they seem like they're pretty broken, and Chalk has corroborated that by saying they're balanced with really long cooldowns, which is just hilarious to me because it's just more bullshit stuff that interrupts you being able to engage with the game. Maybe don't make your stuff require such a massive cooldown to be balanced. Maybe make it so that there's more, ways for the player to use it suboptimally, and thus there are more ways for the player to use it optimally, and thus skill will balance it out, and players who are skilled at using it will naturally outperform players who are not skilled at using it. It's a crazy thought. It's almost like you shouldn't remove animation canceling from League of Legends champions. It's weird. I don't know who would have thought that one. So I think that really does it for the gameplay. We can talk about some of the other stuff, and then I'll close out by basically shilling. So quick notes, because this is a pretty long review actually. Game is buggy. Really, really buggy. Platforming was horrendous, and partially because I think it was really buggy. Like, I would hit space to jump on my glue, for example. Sometimes it just wouldn't happen. Probably some weird issue with the engine that they just never fixed, or maybe they fixed it later on. Some of the bugs may have been fixed by post-launch issues, but I did run a 1.0 version, and it was pretty fucking bad. The fact that this game shipped like this at launch with the save bug as well tells you all you need to know about whether or not this game was rushed out the fucking door before it was stillborn. So, even without the bugs, I think you can really consider the fact that the gameplay communication is horrendous. You look at, for example, the first and only time I ever had to play a log from my data files, I'm pretty sure. Maybe there was a second time, actually, I'm not sure. But the first one that I can think of, the only time I can think of it, and of course when I actually learned that this was even a function of the game, is when I'm trying to recover that dude's piano recordings. I think his name is Igor or something. Iggy, I don't know. And he's the black guy that I rescued from a cargo container. And so that guy has piano recordings that just you have to play a sound file in order to access. And you go there, there's no prompt to do it. like you would think there has been in every other title. I got hacking because I thought I had to hack the dude's computer to do it or something. No, it's actually just something that I have to go into my data section and go into audio logs and play that piece. As if that was ever tutorialized in any respect. As if that's ever come up before. Like, I guess they assumed that I would go back and play it manually instead of just pushing the L button to listen to all of the ones that I haven't listened to. But that's psychotic. So that was really weird. The fact that that even had to be done. That's like a kind of a microcosm, though. I think there's like a lot of issues with the game in terms of the overall idea of the way that they communicated their ideas. The fact that there's really just general lack of consistency where you have to use this mechanic only once ever in the entire game in order to complete a side quest. When the fact that you have to... Oh, yeah, the other issue that I thought was really distinct. Here's a good prank. The sealing the atmospheric breaches doesn't make any sense to me. The first one is like tutorialized to use the glue gun, and then you're never able to use the glue gun on any other one that you see. It's just very strange. I still haven't figured out how to do that. Never will. I don't think I'll play this game again. If I do, it'll be a long time from now. And so there's just really shit gameplay communication. I think the voice acting was by and large, it ranged from serviceable to wooden and like really underacting and blasé. Maybe there were some instances of overacting, but really the thing that you could consider overdone in any way was the animations that went along with this generally wooden and like boring voice acting. Like it's just uninspired, typical, sometimes mediocre or average voice acting paired with these over-the-top animations that are just incredibly dramatized for some reason. And so I think that's a very strange combo that blended to the game's B-movie feel almost is very bizarre. I doubt that was intentional because it really destroyed any immersion that you had and any thematic consistency once again. So that was really funny. I think that every graphic that I took note of as well in this game, besides the animations, you look at the particles being really, really low quality, just awful. Like the resolution of them or something was really off. Compared to the rest of the game anyways. They almost look like placeholders. Then you have all of the Z-fighting and clipping and stuff that's all over the game's environment. The faces looking incredibly bizarre. It actually does look like an alien's interpretation of a face almost. Like a human face looks like this. It's like if somebody, like the game Telephone where you whisper, a sentence into your friend's ear and they whisper a sentence that sentence back into their friend's ear, and it goes on forever until like the last person in line says the sentence back, and it's like a case study on how how different the final thing is from the first thing. Like the initial sentence could be wildly different from the ending sentence. It's like somebody did that with a description of a human face or a picture of a human face, just kept passing it through fucking filters or something, and this is what we ended up with. It's very strange. I can't understand why they did that. I don't even know if I commented on that, but it was something that was really unsettling. Basically everything that I noticed about the game's graphics was that it was pretty, like, it was for the wrong reasons, essentially. It was just awful or very strange, very off-putting. I'd like to say that everything I didn't talk about in this review at least did its job, like, to a serviceable or even mediocre level. But I don't know if I could stand by that claim in good faith because there's just so much wrong with this fucking game. It's really frustrating because of the fact that the concept behind it is really promising. And this is where I'm gonna shill for a moment and pitch you my idea for a similar kind of game. You can even just copy paste a lot of the ideas here and then just basically use my changes or consider my changes. Consider what the game would have been like if this happened instead. So you do get to choose to decide whether or not you want to blow up the station. Obviously, because it's a simulation, it lacks a lot of the impact. And the fact that the ending cutscene is not done in first person like every other element of the game had been up until that point and was afterwards as well. The fact that that's the case is really psychotic. So it completely destroys any sense of like attachment that the player has with what's going on because it's presented in a completely different way, which is another reason why it probably feels less impactful. So, suddenly your viewport is just like no longer an individual, but instead like a camera, a set of cameras that are placed around the station, which is very strange. So, that's definitely something that I think should have been addressed and should not have made it in. But overall, I think it's fine to... Sorry, my voice is going. I'm talking too much. I think it's fine to have the game be a simulation. I think it's good that you got to choose whether or not you wanted to detonate the station or you wanted to save the research. But imagine that the actual setting, you can keep the Talos 1 space station, you can keep all of the same areas, maybe make it bigger, right? I'd like it to be bigger. But I'd definitely like more airlocks. I'd like more space travel. But again, going back to the start of the review where I talked about one of the things that they could have done is make it so that your actions mattered, your inactions mattered. There was dynamic elements going on, that actually matter in some way and occur regardless of your presence and sometimes because of your absence. And so the end result means that there's actually some larger living world happening. And so there's a bunch of, survivors that you can choose to rescue. I like the fact that they had an actual time limit, but instead, I think for immersion's sake, maybe there should just be some like communication between all of these parties, like, hey, I'm trapped in this cargo container in space. Please come get me. And then if you're just too slow, then you get there and the guy's dead, right? But if you are a little bit more, if you're faster, obviously he survives. And then there's just so much going on in the station. It would give it a sense of overwhelming, like you'd feel overwhelmed, like, oh my god, there's so many survivors out there that need my help. There's no way I can get to them all. So now I got to prioritize. And then after that initial setup, you would have, maybe some more survivors who have survived the early game of the station. Maybe that lends itself to some additional content as side releases they're like holed up in safe rooms and they're not, time sensitive, not as time sensitive. Maybe again, if Typhon just take over that area, they would eventually die. But if you're able to go and get them, well, then you'll get more allies. You'll have more supplies. You'll have more whatever they can bring to the table. And so that adds weight to your early stage, the early stages of your gameplay, the early decisions that you make. And that will color the remaining quests that you will get for side content, because the side content never actually felt like it was linked to the main content. It was just stuff that you had to do, fetch quests that you had to do for the sake of, fulfilling some choose your own adventure bullshit at the end. It never really felt like it came full circle. It certainly didn't feel connected to the main story of destroying or saving the station. And so as a result of all of that, what I would say is, for one, all of the side content would be directly related to giving you some advantage to help you in your main objective. And it would also help you along the path to the main objective. And so maybe you have an objective, a side objective for every station, like every section of the station, the arboretum, the bridge, the whatever, to secure those sections. And so doing so would open up another sphere of influence for you. It would allow you to set up more defenses and reinforce the area and be another safe place for your survivors that you've been able to save. And so, I think you guys get the idea, is that there would be some sort of persistent open world environment happening, an actual open world, where the player is tasked with maintaining the integrity of a station long enough to either destroy it or save it, but to remove the Typhon one way or the other. And so by doing so, it actually plays up on the idea that it's a survival game of some sort, except you're trying to have the entire human crew survive. You can decide to cut them all loose and not fuck with them at all and try to speedrun the game, or try to, just play a lone wolf style. Maybe if you use the Typhon powers too much, you have too many of them in you. Not only do turrets start fucking with you, but the other people start trusting you less and less. And there it's not just a bullshit moral choice where a binary thing where you've either chosen to do it or you've chosen not to do it, and it plays into the ending. It's an actual, like, it's relevant to your quest, and you're deciding, am I going to be a lone wolf and try to, say, fuck humanity, fuck the human survivors, I'm just going to do my own thing, I'm just going to focus on what's more powerful to me? Or are you going to say, all right, I'll take it slower, I'll be a bit more conscious of things that are going to get me in hot water with the human survivors, and I will try to make it so that the system, essentially reclaiming the station from the Typhon plague. And that would, I think, then, obviously, with the idea that you have more variety in enemies, more variety in weapons, more variety in other systems that you have to engage with the game, and the fact that the Typhon are almost like a war effort unto themselves, not as organized as a proper war effort would be, but actually involved in a persistent environment within the title, within the space station. I think at that point you would have the opportunity to really characterize the Typhon with their intelligence. And so you'd be forced to make it so that their AI is a bit more intelligent. You'd be forced to make it so that generally allied and enemy AI is more intelligent and can work within themselves so that battles resolve themselves in a reasonable way. And there's this broad scale, this large scale situation. I think that would be a much stronger basis for a title like this, to the point where if you kept everything the same in terms of like the key story elements, the key setting, the key world building elements, and you just take these gameplay concepts and use those instead, I think you have a much better game on your hands. I think you have the basis for something that could become truly great, something that could be really, it would just have more strategy to it as well. It would offer ways to interact with the game that, maybe if you're not a mechanically skilled player, you can't really play the lone wolf style as well. You need to rely a bit more on the stat pads or whatever. But if you're a less skilled player mechanically, but you're better at planning stuff out strategically, you're offering a way to, for those like strategically minded players to express their playstyle by claiming assets in the form of survivors and supplies and whatever other shit you would have, securing these areas, pushing the Typhon back and reclaiming the system. And I guess, maybe there would be some other issues that would be propped up by this as a result of the idea that, hey, you have if you have these completionist players that take over every single area of the station and eventually reclaim the entire thing 100% and make it so that the Typhon only exists outside the station or whatever, then it would be harder for you to justify having any combat at all, right? Well, I think at that point you have to figure out a way to design the game where if players do that, they've earned it, and that's like part of the victory condition or something. At that point, they can just do the remaining quests, in whatever way in whatever order they want to. And maybe there are some areas like the guts or something that are not reclaimable at all by any means because of the nature of the situation. Or maybe you make it so that there's still periodic invasions that perhaps, there's not enough supplies on the ship entirely to, keep everything locked down. And so you'd have to, basically pick your battles and trying to actually secure the entire facility would be incredibly difficult and require a super completionist playstyle where you've played the game several times and you know exactly what to exploit and all this other stuff in order to do it. So it would be possible but very difficult. At that point, it's its own reward, and that wouldn't be something that an average Joe starting out the game would ever be able to do, right? It would be something that a player who's very hardcore and wants to 100% the game in some way, that would be like your epic achievement that you can add to the Steam game and the console port or whatever. But I think that that's a way better idea for a game anyways. I was really disappointed by the fact that you had basically no control over the environment, even though the environment is so cool and the setting is so interesting. I was really disappointed that your enemies never really used the environment. And so I think there's so much that's so much potential with the idea of traversing space to go from place to place, but they didn't really use that at all. There was so much idea, there was even the idea of repairing the station by sealing off those what are they? The hull breaches. That's really fucking cool. The idea that you can repair the station and bring it back up to operational status. And you're never going to make it 100%, fixed, because there's always going to be some stuff that's lost to the vacuum of space. There's always going to be some supplies that you use. A vast majority of the supplies that you're going to use are to beat back the Typhon. But, the idea that you can choose, I'm going to save this station. I'm going to repair it. I'm going to bring it back up to full strength as I can get it to. I'm going to save as many survivors as I can. I'm going to go that that path. I'm going to go down that road, or I'm going to go the other way. I'm planning on blowing up the station anyways, so I'm going to be a lone wolf. I'm going to inject Typhon into my fucking skull. I'm going to, ignore calls for help from the survivors. I'm going to ignore all these side objectives that aren't going to help me directly, because there were a lot of side objectives in the game, like the golden gun, for example, that had nothing to do with helping people, but had everything to do with upgrading your arsenal in some way. And you could have more of that so that there's still room for lone wolf anti-humanity play styles to come into effect, so that those players can still express themselves without having to go through all of the strategic elements of taking and holding territory. Or they could interact to varying gradients, varying degrees of completionist status with those systems, so they could decide, I'm going to take just as many sectors of the space station that I need to in order to win the game, but I'm not really going to focus on that as much. I'm just going to make it so that it's relatively self-sustaining, and I'll just, handle the, risks of the Typhon taking over shit as best I can. And, whatever, come what may at that point. And I also think that there's a lot of potential for, you injecting Typhon into your head so much that the survivors start actively being hostile to you. Maybe they don't hunt you because they don't have the resources, but maybe they are hostile to you. And eventually, it's like a good and evil type thing, but it's rooted in gameplay. It's like I'm actually, focusing my neuromods on, I'm not spending any neuromods on stuff that's going to involve injecting me with Typhon. Instead, I'm spending it on stuff that's going to be still helpful in gameplay, and I'm keeping the survivors in my good graces. But maybe the Typhon, injecting the Typhon eventually makes you an enemy of the survivors, doesn't ally you with the Typhon either. But if you make the Typhon attack each other as well, on occasion, like have, I think they even did that in some scripted events anyways. And if you make them attack each other as well, then you can justify the Typhon still attacking you when the survivors are also attacking you and you're mostly Typhon as opposed to being mostly human. And then it's still based on like you're giving yourself a different kind of advantage by becoming Typhon as well. So that would be so much better. I just feel like that would be such a cool game, and I'm really disappointed in the way that this is what we got basically. So in closing words, I recommend the Surge over this, even though they're completely different games, and the Surge is also shit. But if you haven't played that, I'd give that a run, or I would take a look at some footage on YouTube. Maybe I'll run it myself. It's a Dark Souls clone, and I think it felt more satisfying to play gameplay-wise than this, which says a lot, because Dark Souls is not a good game. So, bye!